The city sidewalks felt even colder as a mother, accompanied by 3 children, walked silently through neighborhoods that seemed unreachable. In front of the door of a luxurious restaurant, she heard the sentence that tore her heart apart. "Mom, I'm hungry." Even without knowing what awaited her, she walked in determined, asking not for charity, but for dignity. The gesture of a stranger would change not only the course of that morning, but an entire life marked by struggle and invisible love. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The morning air in Portland, Oregon hung heavy with moisture as Rebecca Martinez hurried down Burnside Street, her 3 5-year-old children struggling to keep pace. The twins, Emma and Lily, clutched each hand, while her son Mason trailed behind, his curious eyes taking in every storefront they passed. Rebecca tried to smile, tried to project the strength she no longer felt, but the hollow look in their eyes told a story she could no longer hide. They were hungry. Again. 3 weeks had passed since the eviction notice, 2 weeks since her last paycheck from the diner that closed without warning, 1 week since she'd run through her final options, calling numbers that no longer answered, knocking on doors that remained closed. Pride had been a luxury she could afford once, back when she had a studio apartment in southeast Portland and enough for groceries. Now, with her children's stomachs growling and winter approaching, pride felt like a death sentence she couldn't accept. That's when she saw him. Alexander Thornton. Everyone in Portland knew the name, even if they'd never seen the man. The Thornton family owned half the waterfront, their restaurant empire once the crown, jewel of the city's culinary scene. But Alexander himself was a mystery, a recluse who transformed failing businesses into gold mines with ruthless efficiency, yet never seemed to smile, never seemed to connect with the humans behind the numbers. He stood outside what had once been his family's flagship restaurant, the Thornton House, staring at the darkened windows with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read. The building looked tired, she noticed, paint peeling near the edges, the famous neon sign flickering uncertainly. Strange, she thought, for a man worth millions. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. Mason tugged at her sleeve, sensing her hesitation, but Rebecca pressed forward. She'd learned something important in these weeks of desperation. The worst thing anyone could say was no, and she'd already heard that word so many times it had lost its power to hurt. Alexander turned as she approached, his steel-grey eyes sweeping over her worn jacket and the children clinging to her side. She watched his expression shift from annoyance to confusion, then to something harder to identify. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying weight no one else could. "See?" Rebecca took a breath. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She didn't ask for money. She didn't spin a sob story or make promises she couldn't keep. She simply asked if he could spare a meal for 3 children who hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Just food. Nothing more. The request seemed to catch him off guard. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if processing an equation that didn't compute. People asked him for things constantly. She could see him thinking. Investors wanted percentages, employees wanted raises, strangers wanted handouts. But this woman standing before him in clothes 2 sizes too big and shoes held together with determination, wanted only to feed her children. Not herself, just them. Something in his expression cracked. Without a word, Alexander pulled out his phone, made a call, then gestured toward the restaurant entrance. Rebecca hesitated, suddenly aware of how they must look in this place of white tablecloths and crystal chandeliers, even with dust covers over the furniture. But Emma's hand tightened in hers, a silent plea, and Rebecca followed him inside. The restaurant was beautiful even in its decline, high ceilings with exposed wooden beams, walls lined with photographs of Portland from another era, tables that once hosted the city's most powerful families. But there was a sadness to it too, a sense of glory fading into memory. Through the kitchen doors, Rebecca could hear raised voices, the clatter of pans, frustration echoing off stainless steel. Alexander led them to a corner booth, then disappeared into the kitchen. Mason immediately began studying the framed photos on the walls, his natural curiosity undimmed by hunger. Lily leaned against Rebecca's shoulder, while Emma stared wide-eyed at the chandelier above, counting the crystals in a whisper. When Alexander returned, he wasn't alone. A server followed with plates of pasta, bread still warm from the oven, and glasses of milk that made the children's eyes light up with something Rebecca hadn't seen in days: hope. She watched them eat, fighting back tears, trying to remember the last time a stranger had shown them kindness without expecting something in return. Alexander sat across from them, silent, his hands folded on the table. He watched too, and Rebecca wondered what he saw: 3 hungry children devouring food like it might disappear. Or something else, something that made his calculated businessman's mask slip just slightly. As Emma reached for a second piece of bread, she looked up at Alexander with those enormous brown eyes and said simply, "Thank you, mister. This is the best food I ever had." The words were innocent, honest, devastating in their simplicity. Rebecca saw Alexander's throat work, saw him blink rapidly as if dust had gotten in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a roughness she suspected wasn't usually there. He asked her name, asked about the children, asked in a way that suggested he already knew the answer if she had anywhere to go. Rebecca's honesty surprised even herself. She told him everything: the eviction, the job loss, the shelters that were full, the friends who'd stopped answering their phones. She told him about sleeping in the 24-hour laundromat on Division Street, about rationing crackers and water, about the terror that kept her awake, wondering what would happen when she couldn't protect them anymore. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere around day 5. She just spoke the truth, plain and simple, the way you might describe the weather or the color of the sky. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, silence settled over the table, broken only by Mason's quiet question about whether the man in the photograph on the wall was a real sea captain. Then Alexander did something Rebecca never expected. He stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a woman wearing a chef's coat that had seen better days. They spoke in low voices, gesturing toward the kitchen, toward Rebecca, toward the children. The woman's face cycled through surprise, skepticism, and finally something that might have been understanding. Alexander turned back to Rebecca, and in that moment, she saw a man making a decision that terrified him as much as it offered her hope. He asked if she knew how to cook. Rebecca's answer came without hesitation. Yes, she could cook. More than that, she loved to cook. For years, she'd worked in diners, breakfast joints, and small cafes across Portland, places where the food was simple but honest. She'd never had formal training, never attended culinary school, or worked in fine dining, but she understood something that couldn't be taught from textbooks: how to make food that felt like home, that carried memories and comfort in every bite. Alexander studied her carefully, then made an offer that sounded more like a challenge. The Thornton house was dying. Bills were mounting. Reviews had turned cruel. The head chef had quit 3 months ago, and the current kitchen staff seemed more interested in collecting paychecks than saving the restaurant. He needed someone who could bring life back to the menu, who could remember what food was supposed to do, connect people, create moments, tell stories. He offered her a job, not charity. A real position with real pay. Enough to rent an apartment, feed her children, rebuild. In exchange, she'd help him save the restaurant his grandfather had built 70 years ago, the place that bore his family name but had forgotten its soul. Rebecca felt the weight of 3 sets of eyes on her. Emma and Lily had stopped eating, sensing the importance of this moment. Mason stood frozen by the photograph of the sea captain, his small hand pressed against the glass as if anchoring himself to something solid. She said yes, before fear could steal her courage. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the Thornton house before dawn, the children still drowsy from their first night in the modest apartment Alexander had arranged. The kitchen was massive, intimidating, nothing like the cramped spaces she'd worked in before. Stainless steel gleamed under fluorescent lights, industrial ovens hummed with expensive precision, and everything smelled faintly of bleach and disappointment. The staff regarded her with barely concealed skepticism. Most were in their 20s and 30s, culinary school graduates who'd competed for positions at the Thornton House back when it meant something. Now they moved through their shifts with the joyless efficiency of people waiting for unemployment to feel like relief. But it was Charlotte Hayes who made her distrust clear. The sous chef was 35, blonde, impeccably dressed even in her chef's whites, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been promised things. She'd worked at the Thornton House for 8 years, climbing from line cook to Alexander's right hand in the kitchen, and everyone knew she'd expected to be named head chef when the position opened. Instead, Alexander had brought in a stranger, a single mother with no pedigree, no reputation, no credentials beyond years of flipping eggs and slinging hash browns. Charlotte's smile was sharp as she welcomed Rebecca, her words technically polite but laced with implications that everyone in the kitchen understood perfectly. Rebecca ignored the tension and focused on the menu. What she found horrified her. Dishes that cost $40 but tasted like beautiful lies. Truffle foam that added nothing but price. Gold leaf garnishes that screamed wealth but whispered nothing about flavor. This wasn't food, it was performance art for people who'd forgotten why they came to restaurants in the first place. She worked through the afternoon, sketching ideas, testing combinations, building dishes from memory and instinct. She made a braised short rib that fell apart at the touch of a fork, cooked low and slow until the meat remembered tenderness. She created a butternut squash soup that tasted like autumn, warm and golden and impossibly smooth. She baked bread that filled the kitchen with a smell so intoxicating that even Charlotte paused in her deliberate sabotage to inhale deeply. When Alexander arrived that evening, Rebecca served him a simple plate: roasted chicken with herbs from the restaurant's neglected garden, creamed corn made from scratch, and biscuits that crumbled perfectly under butter. Nothing fancy, nothing trying to prove itself, just honest food, prepared with care. Alexander took one bite and went completely still. His fork hovered in the air, his eyes closed, and for a moment Rebecca worried she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he opened his eyes, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Emotion breaking through the careful walls he'd built. He told her about his grandmother, about Sunday dinners in this very building when he was Mason's age, about food that made you feel safe and loved and connected to something larger than yourself. That food had disappeared years ago, replaced by consultants and trends and the desperate pursuit of Michelin stars that never came. But this, what she'd made, this brought it back. Over the following weeks, Rebecca transformed the menu completely. She kept some of Charlotte's technical innovations, but infused them with warmth, with memory, with the kind of soul that made people want to return. Word began to spread. Food bloggers who'd written off the Thornton House started posting about the mysterious new chef. Reservations trickled in, then poured, then required booking weeks in advance. The children became fixtures at the restaurant. Mason organized the supply closet with obsessive precision, creating systems that impressed even the veteran staff. Emma charmed customers with her uninhibited joy, sometimes dancing between tables when the evening rush died down. Lily, quieter and more observant, spent hours with Alexander in his office, asking questions that no one else dared. Why did he look so sad sometimes? Did he have a family? What did he dream about when he couldn't sleep? These conversations changed something in Alexander. The cold businessman who'd built empires through calculated distance found himself looking forward to a 5-year-old's philosophical inquiries. He started staying later at the restaurant, not to review spreadsheets, but to read bedtime stories to the triplets in his office, while Rebecca finished the evening service. He found himself smiling at small things: Mason's latest organizational chart, Emma's terrible but enthusiastic singing, Lily's observation that the restaurant felt happy now, like it had woken up from a long sleep. But Charlotte watched this transformation with growing fury. She'd dedicated 8 years to this restaurant, sacrificed relationships and opportunities, all for the promise of eventually running the kitchen. Now this nobody with 3 kids and no formal training had swept in and stolen everything, including Alexander's attention. If you were in Rebecca's place, would you have trusted the staff, or would you have been more cautious from the start? Tell us in the comments. Charlotte began her campaign slowly, carefully. She'd alter Rebecca's recipes just slightly when working the line, adding too much salt or undercooking components. She'd whisper to suppliers that Rebecca was difficult, causing delays in deliveries. She'd plant seeds of doubt among the staff, suggesting that Rebecca's success was luck, that the restaurant's turnaround was temporary, that Alexander would eventually realize his mistake. But her most dangerous weapon was patience. Charlotte knew how to play the long game, how to build a case that would destroy Rebecca completely when the moment was right. And that moment, she decided, was coming soon. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Alexander found themselves drawn together in ways that transcended their professional partnership. Late nights reviewing recipes turned into conversations about dreams abandoned and hopes resurrected. Shared glances across the kitchen during successful services carried electricity neither wanted to acknowledge. The line between employer and employee, between gratitude and something deeper, began to blur in ways that frightened them both. Rebecca pulled back first. She couldn't risk her children's stability for feelings that seemed impossible. Alexander was a millionaire, a man who belonged to a world of charity galas and waterfront penthouses. She was a woman who'd been homeless a month ago, whose children wore donated clothes, and whose presence in his life was built on fragile ground. Alexander felt her retreat and respected it, even as it hollowed him out. He'd lost someone he loved years ago, a fiancée who died in an accident that still haunted his dreams. He'd sworn never to feel that vulnerable again, never to give someone the power to destroy him with their absence. But Rebecca and her children had already slipped past his defenses, and the thought of losing them terrified him more than any business failure ever could. The restaurant thrived, but their hearts remained in careful suspension, waiting for something neither could name to tip the balance one way or another. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in late October, when Portland's rain hammered against the Thornton House windows with unusual ferocity. The dining room was packed, every table filled with customers who'd waited weeks for reservations. Rebecca moved through the kitchen with practiced grace, calling orders, tasting sauces, adjusting seasonings with the instinct that separated good cooks from exceptional ones. She didn't notice Charlotte's expression as she watched from the prep station, didn't see the sous chef's hands tighten around the knife she was holding, or the calculation flickering behind her carefully neutral eyes. Rebecca was too focused on the halibut she was plating, too absorbed in making sure every dish that left her kitchen carried the standard she'd set. That's when Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He asked to speak with her privately, now. The urgency in his voice sent ice down Rebecca's spine, but she followed him to his office, wiping her hands on her apron as Charlotte watched them leave. In the office, Alexander stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders tight with tension. When he finally turned, his face showed a conflict she'd never seen before. He told her about an offer he'd received that afternoon. Marcus Vega, one of the most powerful restaurant investors on the West Coast, wanted to buy the Thornton House, not to run it, but to demolish it and build luxury condos on the waterfront lot. The price was staggering, enough to solve all of Alexander's financial problems and fund a dozen new ventures. But there was a condition. Vega wanted the deal closed immediately, within 2 weeks. The property had to be vacant, the staff dismissed, the operation completely shut down. No exceptions, no negotiations. If Alexander accepted, Rebecca would have to leave. The children would lose the stability they'd just found. The restaurant that had finally remembered its purpose would cease to exist. Alexander's voice cracked as he spoke. He hadn't made a decision, he said. He was telling her because she deserved to know, because her opinion mattered, because somewhere along the way she'd become more than an employee. But Rebecca could see the war in his eyes. The practical businessman who'd built his fortune on calculated risks versus the man who'd learned to feel again, to care about something beyond profit margins. Rebecca felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She'd known this was temporary, hadn't she? That she was always one bad day away from losing everything again, but she'd allowed herself to hope, to imagine, that maybe this time things could be different, that maybe she and the children had finally found a place to belong. She told Alexander to do what was best for the business. Her voice was steady, professional, even as her heart shattered. She'd survived worse, she reminded herself. She'd find another job, another apartment, another way forward. She always did. But as she walked back to the kitchen, the lie tasted bitter. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was family, purpose, home, and she was about to lose it all. Charlotte struck the next morning. Rebecca arrived to find Alexander in the kitchen, his face pale with fury, surrounded by the senior staff and two people she didn't recognize. They were food critics, Charlotte explained with false concern, who'd received an anonymous tip about health code, violations and ingredient theft at the Thornton house. The accusations were precise and damning. Someone had been stealing premium ingredients, selling them to competitors, and replacing them with cheaper alternatives. Someone had been documenting customers' credit card information for identity theft. Someone had been running a side business, using the restaurant's kitchen after hours. And every piece of fabricated evidence pointed directly at Rebecca. Charlotte had been meticulous. She'd created false receipts with Rebecca's forged signature. She'd planted stolen ingredients in Rebecca's locker. She'd even fabricated text messages suggesting Rebecca was planning to open a competing restaurant using recipes and contacts stolen from the Thornton house. Rebecca stood frozen as the accusations washed over her. She tried to defend herself, to point out the inconsistencies, the impossibilities. She'd never had access to the customer database. She didn't have keys to the restaurant for after-hours entry. The signature on the receipts looked nothing like her actual handwriting, but Charlotte had prepared for every objection. The locks had been changed recently, she said, and Rebecca must have kept an old key. The signature looked different because Rebecca had clearly tried to disguise it. As for the database, well, she'd had months to find ways around security. The evidence was circumstantial, Alexander argued, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. But the critics were already taking photos, making notes, preparing stories that would destroy what remained of the Thornton house's reputation. Even if Rebecca was innocent, even if they could prove it eventually, the damage would be irreversible. Rebecca saw the calculation in Alexander's eyes, saw him weighing her word against the manufactured evidence, the restaurant's survival against his personal feelings. She'd put him in an impossible position. Charlotte's scheme had ensured that. Whether he believed Rebecca or not, keeping her on staff would be a death sentence for the business. She made the decision for him. With Mason, Emma, and Lily watching from the doorway where they'd been playing, Rebecca removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. She told Alexander it was okay, that she understood. She gathered the children, ignored Charlotte's triumphant smirk, and walked out of the Thornton house for what she believed would be the last time. The next 2 weeks were a blur of desperation and defeat. Rebecca called every contact she had, applied for jobs at restaurants across Portland, but Charlotte's whisper campaign had been thorough. Word had spread about the allegations, and no one wanted to take the risk. The apartment Alexander had helped her rent was tied to her employment at the restaurant. She had until the end of the month to vacate. She ended up at St. Francis Shelter in Old Town, a place for families in crisis. The staff was kind, the room clean but crowded, shared with 2 other mothers and their children. Emma cried herself to sleep the first night, asking why they had to leave the restaurant, why Alexander didn't want them anymore. Mason organized their few belongings with quiet intensity, trying to create order in chaos. Lily said nothing, but her silence was worse than tears. Rebecca lay awake on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd lost. Not just a job or an apartment, but the first glimpse of a different life she'd had since becoming a mother. The chance to be more than just a survivor. The possibility of love, of partnership, of building something that mattered. Meanwhile, the Thornton house began to collapse without her. The food lost its magic almost immediately. Customers complained about inconsistency, about dishes that looked beautiful but tasted hollow. Reservations started cancelling. The dining room that had been packed for weeks now sat half empty, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware and disappointed whispers. Alexander threw himself into the kitchen, trying to replicate what Rebecca had created, but he didn't have her instinct, her touch, her heart. Charlotte stepped up, claiming she could restore the restaurant to its former glory, but her technically perfect dishes left customers cold. They wanted what Rebecca had given them, food that felt like coming home. Marcus Vega's offer sat on Alexander's desk, unsigned. The 2-week deadline was approaching, and the logical choice seemed clearer every day. The restaurant was dying again. Rebecca was gone. The dream of saving his family's legacy seemed as foolish now as it had before she'd walked into his life. But something nagged at him. Late one night, unable to sleep, Alexander reviewed Charlotte's evidence again, really looked at it this time, without the panic and pressure of that horrible morning, and he began to notice things, timestamps that didn't align, receipts from days when Rebecca had been provably elsewhere, text messages that used phrases and terminology she'd never employed. He called in a favor from an old friend who specialized in forensic accounting. Within 3 days, the truth emerged. Charlotte had been embezzling from the restaurant for over a year, small amounts carefully hidden in inventory discrepancies. She'd been selling premium ingredients to competitors and pocketing the difference. And when Rebecca's success threatened to expose her scheme through improved oversight and accounting practices, Charlotte had constructed an elaborate frame to destroy her. Alexander felt physically ill as he read the report. He'd failed Rebecca in the worst possible way, believing manufactured evidence over the woman who'd saved his restaurant and taught him how to feel again. He'd let her walk away, let her children see her humiliated, let Charlotte win through his own cowardice. The next morning, Alexander fired Charlotte publicly in front of the entire staff. He called the food critics who'd published the allegations and gave them the forensic report, demanding retractions. Then he got in his car and drove to every shelter in Portland until he found the one where Rebecca was staying. Alexander found her in the shelter's community room, sitting at a scarred wooden table helping Mason with a math worksheet, while Emma and Lily colored quietly beside her. She looked thinner than she had 2 weeks ago, her eyes carrying a weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. When she saw him standing in the doorway, her expression didn't change. She simply looked at him, waiting, as if she'd already braced herself for whatever new hurt he might deliver. The children recognized him instantly. Emma started to run toward him, but stopped when she felt the tension in the room, her natural exuberance dampened by confusion. Mason's face remained carefully neutral, but his small hand found his mother's. Lily just stared with those enormous eyes that always seemed to see too much. Alexander crossed the room slowly, aware of the other families watching, aware that he was an intruder in their safe space with his expensive suit and desperation. He knelt beside the table, bringing himself to eye level with the children, and spoke directly to Rebecca. He told her everything, about the investigation, about Charlotte's betrayal, about his own shameful failure to believe in her when it mattered most. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his role in her suffering. He'd chosen wrong when she needed him to choose right, and nothing he could say would change that. But then he did something Rebecca never expected. He apologized without reservation, without the careful corporate language of someone protecting themselves from liability. He apologized as a man who'd hurt someone he cared about, who'd allowed fear and doubt to override what his heart had known all along. His voice cracked as he admitted that losing her had taught him something crucial. Success without her felt like failure, and all the money Marcus Vega could offer wouldn't fill the emptiness she and the children had left behind. Rebecca listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she looked down at Mason's math worksheet, at the careful way her son had written each number, and took a slow breath. She told Alexander she appreciated the apology, appreciated him clearing her name, but she wasn't sure she could go back to the Thornton house, to that life. The fall had hurt too much. Her children had already lost too many things they'd come to rely on. She couldn't risk their hearts again on something that might break. The rejection hit Alexander like a physical blow, but he understood it. He'd earned her distrust through his own actions. He nodded, started to stand, but Lily's small voice stopped him. She asked, with the devastating honesty only children possess, if he was going to leave them again, if he'd stopped caring about them like everyone else always did. Alexander looked at this tiny girl who'd asked him about dreams and fears, who'd drawn pictures of the 4 of them together that he'd kept in his office drawer, and something inside him shifted permanently. He knelt back down and spoke to all three children, his words careful and true. He told them he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd let fear make him stupid, but that he'd never stopped caring about them. Not for a single moment. He promised that even if their mother decided she didn't want to work with him anymore, he would still be there for them if they needed anything. Not because he had to, but because they'd become important to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. Emma, never one for restraint, burst into tears and threw her arms around his neck. Mason hesitated, then carefully set down his pencil and hugged him too. Lily simply climbed into his lap and said she'd missed him, which somehow hurt and healed at the same time. Over their heads, Alexander met Rebecca's eyes. She was crying silently, her hands pressed against her mouth, and he could see the war happening inside her. The need to protect her children from disappointment, battling against the undeniable connection they all felt, the pull towards something that could be extraordinary if they were brave enough to try again. She asked him what he wanted, really wanted, not as a businessman trying to save a failing restaurant, but as Alexander Thornton, the man who read bedtime stories in his office and learned to smile again because of 3 5-year-olds and their remarkable mother. Alexander's answer was simple and devastating. He wanted them, all of them. He wanted morning chaos, and Mason's organizational charts, and Emma's terrible singing, and Lily's impossible questions. He wanted to build something real with Rebecca, not just in the kitchen but in life. He wanted to be the person they came home to, the one who showed up when things got hard, the one who stayed. He'd turned down Marcus Vega's offer that morning, he told her. Sent the unsigned contract back with a note saying the Thornton house wasn't for sale at any price, because he'd finally understood what his grandmother had known all along. The restaurant was never about money or prestige. It was about creating a place where people belonged, where families were built and memories were made. And he couldn't do that without her. Rebecca looked at her children, saw their hopeful faces, and felt something she'd protected herself against for years, the possibility of trust. Not blind trust, not the naive faith that nothing would go wrong, but the conscious choice to believe that some risks were worth taking, that some people, despite their mistakes, genuinely wanted to be better. She told Alexander she would come back to the Thornton house on 3 conditions. First, she needed full creative control of the kitchen, because she wouldn't survive another betrayal if she didn't have real authority. Second, any relationship they explored outside of work had to move slowly, with the children's stability as the absolute priority. And third, he had to promise that if he ever doubted her again, he would talk to her directly, instead of letting fear make his decisions. Alexander agreed without hesitation. That afternoon they returned to the restaurant together. The staff, having learned the truth about Charlotte's sabotage, welcomed Rebecca back with genuine warmth. The community, reading the retraction stories and learning about her vindication, flooded the reservation line with support. Food bloggers who'd written about the restaurant's decline now chronicled its resurrection with even more enthusiasm than before. Over the following months, the Thornton house became more than just a successful restaurant. It became a gathering place for families, a symbol of second chances, a testament to what could be built when people chose courage over fear. Rebecca's menu evolved constantly, incorporating seasonal ingredients and customer stories, making each meal feel personal and intentional. The children thrived. Mason became the unofficial junior manager, creating systems that the actual managers adopted. Emma's joy became infectious, her laughter a regular sound in the dining room during family mealtimes. Lily spent her afternoons in Alexander's office, still asking impossible questions, still drawing pictures of their increasingly intertwined lives. And slowly, carefully, Rebecca and Alexander built something that transcended their initial connection. They learned each other's wounds and triggers. They practiced the kind of communication that prevents assumptions from becoming disasters. They discovered that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about choosing each other repeatedly, especially when it was difficult. Charlotte's downfall was swift and public. The forensic evidence led to criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Other restaurants she'd worked at, began investigating their own losses. Her career in the culinary world ended not with a bang, but with the quiet recognition that talent without integrity eventually consumes itself. 18 months after that rainy Tuesday when everything had fallen apart, Alexander proposed to Rebecca in the restaurant's kitchen after the last customer had left. There were no photographers, no elaborate displays, just him on one knee surrounded by the tools of her trade, asking if she'd build the rest of her life with him, asking if he could be not just a partner, but a father to 3 extraordinary children who'd taught him what family actually meant. Rebecca said yes, not because he'd saved her from homelessness, not because he owned a successful restaurant, but because he'd proven over months of daily choices that he was willing to grow, to change, to put them first even when it cost him something. The wedding was small, held in the Thornton house on a Sunday afternoon when the restaurant was normally closed. Mason served as ring-bearer with meticulous precision. Emma scattered flower petals with chaotic enthusiasm, and Lily held Rebecca's hand throughout the ceremony, her small presence a reminder of everything they'd built together. The adoption papers were signed the same day. Alexander became legally and emotionally what he'd already been in practice, a father to 3 children who'd entered his life in desperation and stayed to teach him about hope. The Thornton house flourished beyond anyone's expectations. It won awards and accolades, but the real measure of success was simpler. Tables filled with families sharing meals and stories, customers who returned not just for the food, but for the feeling of being somewhere that understood what nourishment really meant, and a kitchen where a woman who'd once been homeless now created magic daily, surrounded by people who loved her and believed in her completely. Marcus Vega eventually approached Alexander again with another offer, this time to partner rather than buy. Alexander declined politely, explaining that the Thornton house wasn't about maximizing profit or scaling up. It was about being present, being excellent, being enough. Some things, he'd learned, were worth more than money could measure. On quiet mornings before the restaurant opened, Alexander would sometimes find Rebecca in the kitchen, testing new recipes while the children did homework at the prep table. He'd watch them together, this family he never thought he'd have, and feel overwhelmed by gratitude for the morning a desperate woman had asked him for a simple meal and accidentally taught him how to live again. The restaurant that had been dying was now thriving. The man who'd been alone had found belonging. The woman who'd lost everything had discovered that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, better one. And 3 children who'd known hunger and uncertainty now understood that family wasn't just about blood, but about the people who chose you, who stayed, who built something beautiful from the broken pieces. Dear listeners, we hope Rebecca and Alexander's story touched your heart. If you were moved by their journey from desperation to belonging, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Was it Rebecca's courage, Alexander's transformation, the children's resilience? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, the power of second chances, and the truth that love can emerge from the most unexpected places. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.